Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and the military history or the specific military campaigns carried out by ancient Rome are very famous and in some cases, of course, infamous. However, as per the title of this video, today we're focusing on a word: genocide. You will find several channels and sometimes posts that mention this when it comes to the Romans, saying that they committed genocide or that someone like Julius Caesar was a genocidal maniac. But did the Romans technically commit genocide? In other words, is it a correct term to use when it comes to the atrocities that occurred during Rome's expansion, or would it be anachronistic and out of place? Did the Romans commit genocide? Usually when we talk about the accusation of genocide when it comes to the ancient Romans, we're referring to three specific instances. One, Julius Caesar or Julius Caesar against the Gauls, so the Celtic populations that lived in pretty much what is modern-day France. Two, the actions carried by Scipio Africanus against the Carthaginians in what would be modern-day Tunisia, North Africa. And three, the actions perpetrated by Caracalla under the direct command of his father, at the time Emperor Septimius Severus, when it comes to the Caledoni, so the populations of Caledonia, modern-day Scotland. In contemporary historical literature, particularly active school of thought in recent years has brought to light critical issues related to various aspects of the assertion of Roman hegemony, specifically concerning methods of conflict management, conquest, and attitudes towards defeated and subjugated people. The risk of applying contemporary standards to an ancient context can lead to seemingly straightforward reasoning that starts from inconsistent assumptions, using moral and ethical categories formed and rooted in our society in response to a specific historical path, which in ancient socio-cultural contexts was still far from emerging. In other words, self-criticism and self-analysis regarding the events of the British Empire, for instance, and colonial Europe in general, have certainly played a crucial role in this form of historical approach. And while the perspective of raising moral questions regarding the imperialistic dynamics of the ancient world can generate interesting analytical insight, the risk of a transfer phenomenon should sound as a caveat that we cannot lightly ignore. One of the most striking cases is the attribution of the label genocide to actions of various figures in the Roman world. To begin this topic correctly and address the item in question, we need to first define what the word genocide means exactly. Genocide is a modern term created by historian Raphael Lemkin in relation to Nazi crimes in German-occupied Europe, more specifically the crimes of the Holocaust. The term was then retrospectively applied to the case of the Armenians at the beginning of the 20th century and to that of Native Americans, and in the Spanish conquest of the New World. More recently, genocide has been applied to define cases in Uganda, former Yugoslavia, Myanmar, China, and a lot of other instances. The crime of genocide is defined by the United Nations Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in 1948 and entered into force in 1951. Open quotes. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as a. Killing members of the group, b. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, c. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, d. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, e. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So first of all, what we learn from these definitions is that the intention to destroy is crucial and central, and in fact it doesn't really matter if the intention was fully or partially realized. So starting from this definition, let's see if this term can be correctly applied to what happened during the military campaigns in ancient Rome. Caesar's campaign in Gaul, and in particular some specific episodes involving certain Celtic and Germanic populations, is one of the cases most often cited when attributing genocidal practices to the Romans. One of the most frequently cited episodes is that of the Usipetes and the Tencteri, two Germanic populations who had migrated to Gaul after being driven from their lands by the more powerful Germanic nations of the Suebi. Identifying them as a dangerous element for his hegemonic aspirations in Gaul and a harbinger of instability, Caesar approaches them with his legions and first tries to convince them to return to Germany, offering them to settle near the Ubi people, a population with which he had established alliance relationships and over which he could exert pressure. However, he received evasive answers, and after fruitless negotiations, which, according to the commander, were only meant to allow the Germans to organize for an offensive, the Roman cavalry is attacked and routed by that of the barbarians. Caesar's response is immediate and deadly. The following day, the legionaries swooped down on the enemy, evidently unprepared, and the commander reports, open quotes, "Their fear was evident from their shouting and chaotic running. Our soldiers, driven by the previous day's betrayal, broke into the camp, where those of the enemy who managed to quickly take up arms resisted for a short time. Meanwhile, the masses of other people, women and children, since the Germans had left home and crossed the Rhine with their entire families, began to flee in all directions. Caesar sent the cavalry to pursue them. When the Germans heard cries rising behind them and saw that their people were being massacred, threw away their weapons and rushed out of the camp. When they reached the point where the Rhine and the Meuse meet, they lost all hope of escape. A large number of them were killed. Others threw themselves into the river and perished there, overwhelmed by panic, fatigue, and the strength of the current. All our men survived, and only a few remained wounded." Close quotes. It is also important to understand that even though when we read for instance, the Bello Gallico or other military-related texts, yes, much of it could be propaganda, with that being said, we do know that this event actually happened, as the site of the massacre was indeed identified in 2015 by Dutch archaeologist Nico Roymans. However, just to increase the amount of data we have to work with, there are 3 more examples, instances in which some people may decide to attach the word genocide. Let's review them. In 57 BC, Caesar obtained the submission of the Accusations people, a Belgian tribe of Germanic origin. They opened the gates of their city to the legionaries and surrendered, but then treacherously attacked them at night. As traitors and perjurers, Caesar then turned against them. Their city was sacked, and 53,000 people were enslaved and sold to merchants. In the autumn of 54 BC, Caesar stationed 15 cohorts, 1.5 legions, more than 5,000 men, in a winter camp among the Belgian people of the Eburones. Attacked by the Belgians, the Roman managed to repel them, and subsequently Ambiorix, chief of the Eburones, came to parley. The Belgian king complained of being forced into battle by popular will and pressure from neighboring tribes, and apparently to repay a past debt of gratitude he had with Caesar, who had freed his people from subjugation by the neighboring tribe of the Accusations and had returned his son and grandson, held by them as hostages. He warned him that all of the Belgian tribes had conceived a common plan to attack all of the Roman camps on the same day, so that no mutual support would be possible. Showing apparent goodwill, Ambiorix promised the Romans safe passage to the borders of his territory. After an intense debate in their war council, the Romans evacuated their camps. However, Ambiorix's plan was a deception, and the legions were ambushed, being annihilated almost to the last man. In the Bello Gallico, Caesar leaves no doubt about the serious errors of Sabinus, the commander in charge, but his anger is directed against Ambiorix, whom, it is understood, Caesar had considered a friend, and whose betrayal he took very personally. In the summer of 53, Caesar organized a systematic hunt to capture Ambiorix, who narrowly escaped. The army burned the villages and buildings of the Eburones, destroyed their crops, hunted the herds, and killed anyone they could find. Those who survived died of hunger. In 51, Caesar returned to the lands of the Eburones, but since he no longer had hopes of capturing Ambiorix, he reports, open quotes, "The best thing Caesar could do for his honor and reputation was to devastate his territory in such a way, destroying his inhabitants, buildings, and herds, that if by chance any one of Ambiorix's people remained alive, they would never allow him to return to his nation," close quotes. And of course, the purposes of his actions were quite explicit, as we read, open quotes, "that the nation and its very name might be eradicated for the terrible crime they had committed," close quotes. As another example, we have what happened in the winter of 53 or 52 with the Carnutes people, in whose country the central sanctuary of the Druids was located. They initiated the Pan-Gallic revolt against Caesar, which would soon find its champion in Vercingetorix, and they began that by massacring the Roman merchants who had settled in the city of Cenabum. A year later, with the Pan-Gallic revolt crushed at Alesia, or Alesia, following complaints from the Carnutes' neighbors, Caesar led 2 legions against them in the harshest of winters, open quotes. The Carnutes scattered in flight and abandoned their villages and their towns, close quotes. But Caesar sent light troops and cavalry, open quotes, whenever the enemy was reported to be heading. The Carnutes were overwhelmed by the difficulties of winter and the fear of dangers surrounding them. Driven from their homes, they dared not stay long in any place, and during the most severe period of the year, they found no refuge in the woods. Scattered as they were, they lost a large part of their population, and the rest dispersed among neighboring nations. Close quotes. At first glance, it does appear that the events relating to the Eburones people and what happened to them sort of satisfy the UN criteria for genocide, and as we read in Caesar's words himself, open quotes, that the nation and its very name would be eradicated for the terrible crime they had committed, close quotes. Thus, we can see that there definitely was an intent for total annihilation. Moreover, in the case of the Carnutes people, his choice of timing, the coldest winter, and method of proceeding leave no doubt about his intention, as do the methods implemented against the Atuatuki people, with national annihilation through total enslavement. Although different, the case of the Usipetes people and the Tencteri people could also be prefigured as genocide. Caesar did not tolerate these Germans in Gaul, and because they refused his proposals and did not leave voluntarily, he destroyed them through a total massacre following their military defeat. It is important to note that of the 4 categories mentioned in the UN Convention, only the national group fits Caesar's case, in the sense that his victims were Celtic and Germanic nations, despite the prejudice evoked by the term barbarian and despite Caesar's efforts to evoke a sense of otherness regarding the Gauls and especially the Germans through stereotypical negative character traits, such as the Gauls fickle and inconstant, the Germans are arrogant and treacherous. Caesar never annihilates Gauls and Germans because of their ethnic, racial, or religious difference from the Romans. And this is a crucial aspect to be considered. Total annihilation, which is always relative only to national identity, appears to be an extreme measure that is imposed in response to the infraction of the Ius Gentium, the law of nations. The Usipetes and Tencteri people attacking the Roman cavalry while negotiations were in progress, the Atuatuki treacherously attacking after apparently submitting, the Eburones after lying and guaranteeing safe passage, the Carnutes after massacring Roman merchants at Cenabum. So from the perspective of the ancient Romans, which is what we are trying to also take into account in this situation, these will be all cases in which, and I'm using the following word very lightly, the nations that we are discussing had committed such misdeeds as to be automatically deprived of their legal status as nations. Now, of course, while Julius Caesar's actions, from a more general standpoint, are absolutely ferocious, it is very important to contextualize them within the context of a military campaign. And it is also very important to understand fully the cultural and historical context in which they occur. This will help us to be professional in our analysis and avoid superficial parallels. So let's do just that. Let's begin with a term of comparison. The NAZI policy, for example, which led to the birth of the term genocide itself, was based on an ideology that was independent of war, even if its implementation was facilitated by the war itself. The Armenian genocide also had a long prehistory of persecution and oppression. Unlike these and other modern cases of genocide, comparable also to those committed during the Spanish conquests in the New World, all of Caesar's quote-unquote genocidal actions take place in the context of war, to which they are inextricably connected. Another contextual element is the fact that ancient wars, especially against foreign people, knew few moral limitations, and these concerned diplomacy more than fighting and killing. The historian Luciano Canfora has suggested that Roman public opinion had reacted with horror to the massacre of the Usipetes and Tencteri people, and that for this reason Cato had suggested surrendering Caesar to the Germans. However, in reality, as it emerges in Plutarch, Cato based his proposal to extradite Julius Caesar not on the massacre, which, to be fair, was actually welcomed with celebrations as a military victory by the people, but specifically on the belief that Julius Caesar had committed it during a truce, holding the barbarians' ambassadors prisoners, and if Caesar had never had a problem enumerating the deaths of his opponents and the atrocities inflicted even on civilians, in the case of the Usipetes and Tencteri, he ensures that his testimony frees him from the guilt of having broken a truce, because of the negotiations are in reality a pretext for the Germans, and above all, they are the ones to attack first. To further deepen the context in which this whole situation developed, we have to understand this. These two Germanic people, so the Usipetes and the Tencteri, were, as we said, pushed into Gaul. They don't go into Gaul out of their own volition, they are pushed into Gaul by another Germanic tribe, the Suebi. But as they reach Gaul, these are not harmless, defenseless migrants. In fact, the first thing they do is to try and occupy the lands of the local native Belgian populations of the Menapi, who lived in villages on both banks of the Rhine, and after initially failing, they succeed through deception, open quotes. In a single night, the cavalry of these two Germanic people covered the entire journey and unexpectedly swooped down on the unsuspecting Menapi, who had returned to their villages beyond the Rhine without fear, because their scouts had confirmed the departure of the enemy. The Germans massacred the Menapi and, having seized their ships, crossed the river before news of what had happened reached the other bank, having occupied all the Menapi's buildings. They then used their provisions for the remaining part of the winter, the Bello Gallico 4-4. Close quotes. Now, given Julius Caesar is not very clear in outlining the fate of the Menapi, but in fact we have an entire nation that is partially massacred, and what remains is deprived of its houses and its provisions in the middle of winter. If Caesar carried out a genocidal massacre against the Usipetes and the Tencteri, we then find ourselves in the position of having to recognize that they had just finished doing the same to the Menapi people, who were in fact the native people of that specific land. So is now Caesar a liberator, someone who carried out a just revenge? Well, that of course is very much of a stretch, but still, we will have to agree that there is a lot of context within this specific historical occurrence. Now, the reality is that the concept, or at least a similar concept to that which could be considered the genocidal massacres that occurred during times of war, does happen multiple times in the ancient world. Look at, for example, the conquest or the capture of Jericho that is expressed in Joshua 6:17 and 18. Open quotes, "Everything in the city was completely annihilated, men and women, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the sword." Close quotes. But a similar concept is also found in the Greek world. And in fact, this idea that we can connect, at least somewhat, to the modern concept of genocide can be found in the Greek, probably most popular poem or epic poem, the Iliad. In the Iliad, Menelaus is about to take a Trojan prisoner for ransom when Agamemnon intervenes. Open quotes. "My good Menelaus," said he, "this is no time for giving quarter. Has then your house fared so well at the hands of the Trojans? Let us not spare a single one of them, not even the child unborn and in its mother's womb. Let not a man of them be left alive, but let all in Ilion perish, unheeded and forgotten." Iliad 6:34. Close quotes. Interestingly enough, a paraphrase of the same passage from the Iliad is attested in Cassius Dio, as he is speaking about Septimius Severus. For context, in this specific period, Septimius Severus was in fact trying to negotiate with some of the populations or native tribes of Caledonia, so modern-day Scotland. But then some of these tribes decide to break their allegiance with Rome and begin to assemble and unite together. At this point, Septimius Severus is extremely angered and gives a specific command to his son Caracalla to be carried out by force with Roman legions. He says, open quotes, "Let no one escape sheer destruction, no one our hands, not even the babe in the womb of the mother, if it be male, let it nevertheless not escape sheer destruction." Cassius Dio, Epitome, close quotes. Interestingly enough still, to find a difference or a point of divergence again with the modern concept of genocide in connection to 1930s and 1940s Germany, we see that even in this case, a brutal command is not given because of the desire to annihilate a people because of their ethnicity or because of their national identity. It is a product of the revolt of the Maeatae, a federation of tribes located in Scotland between the Forth and the Tay, that was allied and subject to the Romans, and whose uprising is experienced as an act of betrayal by the Romans. Now, before people start making response videos and debunking videos when they accuse me of being a pro-genocide maniac, I mean, that's the level of stupidity of some of my detractors, let me make this clear. Of course, from a human perspective, and even I want to say from a contemporary perspective, all of these actions are indeed atrocities. And the idea that not only fighting men or enemy soldiers are being attacked and annihilated, but women, children, and infants and babies is horrendous. This should be obvious, but anyways, I'll state it. With that being said, today we're discussing still the relevance of the modern term genocide in the ancient context. Just to remember, this is what we are dealing with. So let's dive even deeper. As we have brought to light, some forms of genocide were not at all foreign to the ancient world as an occasional byproduct, although never the cause, of armed conflicts, aimed at the annihilation of a nation that often, at least in the Roman context, had committed an infraction of the jus gentium. However, there is a partial exception to this rule, and that has to do with Sulla's measures against the people called Samnites, which, even though do originate in a military context, they will eventually reach a very grim expression. The Samnites, after a series of incursions into Latium as far as Ardea, and after having devastated the region of Campania, greatly extended their dominion. The Campanians, who were already accustomed to being commanded in a despotic manner, obeyed their orders. At the present day, however, they had been almost completely exterminated by various Roman generals, and lastly by Sulla, who held the greatest power in Rome. Sulla, after having quelled the Italic revolt in various battles, observed that the Samnites, almost without exception, remained united and had a single purpose, and that they therefore marched against Rome itself. Consequently, he fought against them under the walls of the city, and, since he had given orders not to take prisoners, many of them were cut to pieces on the battlefield, while the survivors, about 4,000 men who had thrown down their arms, were taken to the Villa Publica in the Campus Martius and locked up there. 3 days later, soldiers were sent who killed them all, and when he compiled his proscription list, he did not rest until he had annihilated or driven from Italy anyone who bore a Samnite name. To those who reproached him for his ferocity, he replied that he had learned that no Roman could live in peace as long as even a single Samnite survived, and indeed, to this day, the cities are reduced to villages, and some, in fact, have disappeared altogether. Bovianum, Aesernia, Panna, Telesia, near Venafrum, and others like them, none of which is worthy of being considered a city. Strabo 5:4-11. Close quotes. Already enemies and adversaries of Rome between the second half of the 4th and the first decades of the 3rd century BC, once they were defeated and forced to sanction a so-called foedera, that is, a diplomatic agreement that provided for alliance and submission, the Samnites had partly rebelled when Hannibal descended into Italy, but above all, they had played a central role in the uprising of the Italian Socii. The dynamics relating to Sulla, however, do not concern the uprising of the social war, but the subsequent conflict that had seen him opposed to Gaius Marius in the First Roman Civil War. Since Sulla was a champion of the Roman aristocracy, it was logical that the Samnite communities, led by the commander Pontius Telesinus, would side with Marius. This is why Sulla's actions are important in this case, because compared to other so-called genocidal massacres, they do differ significantly. 1. The Samnites in this specific case did not rebel against the Romans by betraying and breaking the jus gentium, but rather sided with one of the two Roman parties in the civil war. 2. The proscription lists are a calculated, methodical, and prolonged instrument of political purging, not an extemporaneous massacre during a military operation. Sulla persecuted the Samnites with all means at his disposal to purge them from Italy, and evidently attributed a pernicious character to their ethnicity specifically. 3. It wasn't only the Samnites who supported Gaius Marius and marched on Porta Collina, but also the Lucanians, led by Marcus Lamponius. Yet, Sulla doesn't seem to want to pursue them continuously, as he did with the Samnites. The Samnite persecution cannot therefore be prefigured solely as punishment for supporting Marius, but evidently a personal evaluation by Sulla himself that was added to this. Because of all of these considerations, I think the only actual case within Roman ancient history and military operations that we could in fact say is very close to the contemporary definition of the word genocide would be the massacre of the Samnites at the hands of Sulla, albeit with all the necessary distinctions of the case. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.